Hi guys, and welcome to the third lesson on our rivers unit. So far we have addressed the water cycle and the human uses of a river. In today's lesson we're going to be exploring the origins and the key terms that we need to understand when we are talking about rivers. As always, your task is going to be to watch this video and at the end there will be a review question I would like you to answer and upload onto Satchel 1. So, as always, we'll start off with a little bit of a recap. So in our first lesson of this term, we were looking at something called the water cycle. Now, the water cycle was that process by which water leaves and re-enters the land on Earth. So, for example, water leaves the surface of the Earth through evaporation and transpiration, where the water is turning into a vapour, and as it is warm and less dense, it rises into the atmosphere. Over time, that will then cool and condense, which is condensation, and that process is where clouds are then formed. Over time, those clouds become very heavy, and they release that water back down to Earth in the form of precipitation. And precipitation is our scientific word for any water that falls from clouds, which is rain, snow, sleet and hail. And in our second lesson, we then looked at, well, how do humans actually use rivers? And so we came up with three main ways. Primarily, early civilizations used rivers for their water access. When the people who settled in Tokyo, in Rome, in Paris, in London, were building these cities, they were doing so to access water and also food. Over time, as those civilizations grew, they then began to use those rivers for transport. So, for example, it might have been the case that if you were in the Netherlands, because there are rivers connecting most of mainland Europe, you could use boats to transport your trade and goods to other parts of Europe, hence the economic benefit of that. And then finally, in a modern development, we looked at the idea that rivers are actually being used for energy production as well. And here's the idea, the key term was hydroelectric power, and it's the concept that humans can now harness the power of rivers to create electricity. So as water flows through the turbine, it creates electricity, which we can then use to power our homes, turn our light switches, to play our Xbox, turn on the TV, etc. So there are three main uses. However, in today's lesson, we're now going to start focusing a bit more on the sciencey aspects of the river. And essentially, in order for the water cycle to complete, once we've had our precipitation, and remember, that's the water in rain, hail, sleet or snow falling to the earth, it has to go back into the cycle. And it does that via a process called surface runoff. And surface runoff is the transfer of water over the surface of the ground. And the easiest way we can see that happening is on a river. And so today we're going to be focused on this new key term, which is something called a drainage basin. Now, a drainage basin is an area of land drained by one river and its tributaries. And this is going to make a bit more sense once I go through this PowerPoint. So a drainage basin, an area of land drained by one river and its tributaries. And we're going to look at a couple of key words here. So don't worry too much at the moment about understanding what they are. We're going to go through each of them in some detail. And they are the source, the mouth, a tributary, a confluence, the watershed, and a catchment area. And to kind of help you visualize what I'm talking about here, this entire thing on the screen now is a drainage basin. So it's that area by which a river and its tributaries are drained. And on there are lots of words, such as the start of the river, where two rivers meet, where a river meets the sea, the boundary of a drainage basin. And essentially, all those words are going to be the key terms we look at today. So when we go back to this, you should be able to identify it quite easily. So without further ado, we'll start off with our first key term, and that is the source of the river. And essentially, the source is where the river begins. It is the start of a river. All rivers have a source, and they tend to take place on high land. So, for example, the source of a river will usually be in a mountainous area. And when we're looking at the source, they tend to only look like very small streams. They don't look like the big, large rivers we see normally. They're very, very limited in size, and they look more like a trickle than the flow we used to see in. So, for example, a lot of us will have seen the River Mersey in Liverpool at some point, or at least heard about it. If I follow the River Mersey back to its source in the mountains of the Pennines near Manchester, this is what it would look like. So the rivers start off really, really small, and over time they tend to get bigger as more water is added to them. So the source is the start of the river. At the end of the river is something called the mouth. Okay, so the mouth is the end of the river where it meets the sea. And in reality, this is what that would look like. So you can see from right to left, the river is flowing into the sea. And so the river will always have a source and it will always have a mouth as well. You should notice that by this point, the river is a lot wider than it is in the source. And the next couple of lessons, we will be explaining why that is the case, essentially. And that's kind of a key point of this topic. So, there are our first two key terms. The next two are very similar, but also equally important. So, a tributary is a smaller river that joins a larger river. Okay? And the reason why this is important is because in reality, rivers can sometimes look a bit more like this. And the idea is that this big one here would be the main flow of the river. Okay? These smaller little wiggly bits here that are flowing into the river, they would be called tributaries. Okay? And the idea is that even though there is one official source of a river, there might be water coming from multiple different places within the drainage basin, and kind of think of it like an extra tap, with this being the main bath. So a tributary is where a smaller little river is joining the main river, and you can also see that within this tributary here, there are tributaries within that as well. So it's a very, very huge system, and that's why sometimes it's quite hard to work out how long a river is, because some people would argue that they are longer or shorter based on its tributaries. And then the second key term, this one gets a bit confusing, is a confluence. And a confluence is the point at which two rivers join. Now this is slightly different to a tributary, because for a tributary it's a smaller river, but for a confluence it's two rivers of the same size basically. And when they join, this area here would be called the confluence, and it creates a new singular river over here. So this river A and river B might join to form river C, and that would be called a confluence. Our penultimate key term is something called a watershed. Now, if we go back to our very first diagram, I showed you this idea of a satellite image. So this little dotted line here is the boundary of a drainage basin. So what it's saying is that for this river, all the water is contained within this boundary. There would be, for example, another drainage basin outside of this boundary. And it's a really important concept because obviously, if we are talking about a singular river, if we're talking about the River Nile, the River Thames, it will have its own personal watershed. They tend to be along highlands and ridges. So, for example, the watershed tends to be along highland because obviously water can only flow downwards with the flow of gravity. So, if it was lowland, the watershed would be much, much wider than it is there. Okay, so a watershed is the boundary of a drainage basin, and they tend to be quite high land because that keeps the water in basically. So kind of think of it as like a contained system. Now in real life, this is obviously a really big area. We'd have cities within a watershed. We have the entire flow of a river. So actually, this could be hundreds of miles within one watershed. But to make it a bit easier for you, that's obviously a simplified image. And the last key term there is the catchment area. And the catchment area is basically the area within the watershed. So this entire area here is the catchment area. This entire area within here is the catchment area. Okay? And so if we go back to the very start of our lesson again, when you're looking at this map now, you should hopefully be able to see where the key terms come in. So the start of the river is called the source. Where a river meets the sea is called a mouth. Where two rivers meet is the confluence. The boundary of a drainage basin is the watershed. And a smaller river that feeds the main channel is called the tributary. So I'm going to have a bit of a challenge here now, because I'm quite interested to see if we'll be able to do this or not. What I've done then is I've taken a diagram which has no labels, no words rather, and I've just tried to label some of the key features of a drainage basin. Those key features are all the exact same ones as we have just covered. I want you to see if you can write them down and work them out. So with a pen and a piece of paper, have that out in front of you now, and then jot down what you think each of those will be. Reminder, if you need some help, try and find the start and the end of the river, and the rest should make sense from that. So pause this video, and with a piece of pen and paper now, can you jot down some ideas about what this would be? It might take you a couple of minutes, and then unpause once you've done. Okay, let's go through them then. So our first one over here is the source. I've added this in as a confluence, catchment area, tributary, watershed, and mouth. So hopefully the watershed, the source, the mouth, and the catchment area should have been okay. If you got the tributary and the confluence a little bit mixed up, that's absolutely fine. They are very, very similar. Remember, usually a tributary is a smaller stream or river joining, and that's what the clue should be. So to finish off then, guys, slightly different to normal. Rather than 3 review questions, I want you to do a piece of extended writing for this lesson, please. And the extended writing is explain the features of a drainage basin. So you would have to write that question and then answer it underneath as an extended piece of writing, e.g. at least 2 or 3 paragraphs. So to explain the features of a drainage basin, these are the features of a drainage basin: the source, the watershed, the mouth, etc. So for you to answer that question, you need to talk about all those different features, and if you write that in 4 sentences, you should be able to get a fairly substantial piece of writing, and you should be able to add in some good description as well. As always, if there are any questions, you can join the live Zoom support, or you can leave a message on Satchel1.